What is up, everybody? Thank you for tuning into this U.S. Men's National Team Copa America recap video. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content going up on the channel. I promised a recap, reflection, thoughts video after the Uruguay game. I wanted to see if the U.S. could pull this off before putting all of these thoughts in order. Obviously, that did not happen. So the U.S. is out of Copa America, and here we go. I broke this kind of into two sections. I want to talk about the game itself a little bit, and then three specific areas moving forward, because now that's the big question, is looking ahead in a short 2 years to the World Cup on home soil. The Uruguay game itself. And it seems like most people have come to this conclusion, and it is the right one, that two things can be true. I say that pretty consistently on here. The refereeing was atrocious, and the U.S. was not good enough and did not deserve to win that game. The referee is not the reason the U.S. did not beat Uruguay. The goal and the VAR drama with that, Dale Johnson, who is ESPN's refereeing VAR expert, wrote a piece explaining why it was ruled onside, that essentially because there's no semi-automated technology, the way that it was done with the lines, it was close enough that it was within the margin of error. Was he offside? Probably. But it was close enough that you're not overturning that. That's just the way that it works. Certainly looked offside, but those angles are deceiving. I make that point all the time too. The angle that CONMEBOL eventually provided also looked bizarre. I will acknowledge that. So I don't know if he was offside or not. And ultimately it doesn't matter, because that goal didn't change anything. U.S. still needed more. Whether that was help from Bolivia or them actually doing themselves a favor and putting a goal on the board against Uruguay. They're not out of Copa America because of a controversial offside decision. The advantage with the yellow card in the first half, I don't know what the ref was doing. Again, that's not the reason the U.S. is going home. Big picture, and the Uruguay game was an example of this. But the reason Panama is advancing and the U.S. isn't is because Panama took their chances and the U.S. didn't. That game easily could have ended 2-1 to the U.S., the Panama game. Did they create all that many chances down a man? No. But they did create some. And Panama didn't create all that many chances up a man, but they created some and they scored one of them, with the game tied 1-1. Panama scored as many goals against Bolivia as the U.S. did in the entire tournament. Gregg Berhalter can sit here and talk about XG and winning the XG battle all he wants in his post-game press conferences, like he did after the Uruguay game. But XG only means so much because there is this other important part that's called finishing. And there are teams who are just simply not good at finishing. I'm not sure the U.S. falls into that category. But you can't just look at XG, because that doesn't tell the whole story about who the better team was. Some teams are just better at finishing, or better at finishing on that given day. And in this tournament, Panama was better at finishing. That's why they're going through. It's not like they were significantly better than the U.S. over 3 games. You could make an argument they were worse. But they took their chances. The U.S. didn't. That's what it comes down to in high-level knockout tournaments against really good opposition. That's really all I had on the game. I just wanted to throw that stuff out there at the start of the conversation. Of course, now the big discussion moving forward is Gregg Berhalter. And I have kind of 3 different sections I want to hit on here. The first being, as this review happens, as U.S. Soccer and Matt Crocker make a decision about whether he's going to continue, we have got to be specific with the criticism and the frustrations being levied at Gregg Berhalter. This is not an attempt to defend him, but just a request to acknowledge, generally speaking, and especially in this case, that coaches cannot just get blamed for everything that goes wrong. Players have to take responsibility too. Again, I'm not absolving Gregg Berhalter, but I want to lay out some of the things that he should really have to answer questions for, and some things that he should not have responsibility laid at his feet for. The first one. And I didn't get a chance to actually do a recap video because I was on the road after the Panama game. So this is the big point I would have made there. I just kind of saved it in this larger conversation because I had a feeling we were going to get to this very point. I saw a lot of criticism and frustration that Berhalter didn't go for it against Panama. Down a man. And the part of that I do not understand is really twofold. One, that makes it really easy to ignore what would have happened if Berhalter had gone for it and then the U.S. lost 3-1 or 4-2 or something, where he willingly sacrificed that point to try and win playing down a man. People would have lost their minds. You can't just criticize him because of the result. This is one of my big fundamental things when evaluating sports. You have got to look at the process and the decision making and the rationale for it. If the U.S. had held on for a 1-1 draw against Panama, the one that Gregg Berhalter was playing for, and these results in these final games had gone the exact same way, the U.S. would have gone through on goal difference. It would not have been pretty, it would not have been impressive, but they would have gotten the job done. That point he was playing for was incredibly valuable. It was the right decision. Obviously, they didn't execute. They didn't hold on to that point. That's why they're going home. More than anything else. But it was not a bad fundamental decision. It was the right one. I firmly believe that. Does he bear some of the responsibility for the lack of execution and the fact that the U.S. gave up a goal 3 minutes or whatever it was after taking the lead in that game? Sure. That's where you can have the criticism. The idea of playing for that point, to me, he should be applauded for it. I know that's, not fun, it's boring, but that would have changed the entire situation of the tournament because you would have taken 2 points away from Panama. That was ultimately your goal in that game. They nearly did it. I have no issue with the decisions Berhalter made in terms of approach and substitutions and things like that in that game. The other things. He is not the player who decided to whack somebody upside the head 18 minutes into a very important game against a CONCACAF opponent who you know is trying to wind you up. He is not the one who missed all of those chances against Bolivia that ultimately didn't really matter, but would have helped the goal difference situation. And he's not the one who allowed Uruguay to score on a second phase of a set piece by basically just not marking after Matt Turner made the first save. Players have to take some of this responsibility too. I also firmly believe the U.S. is going through in this tournament if Tim Weah doesn't get that red card. That was inexcusable and had nothing to do with Berhalter. Berhalter told his team Panama was going to do that, and Weah still chose to excuse himself from the game and completely change the way it was going to be played. So those are the things I will 100% go to bat for Berhalter on. The stuff that we should be focusing on in terms of should he continue or not. And if you want him gone, to me, this is why. There are two big things here. One of them that's getting a lot of conversation is just the general lack of progress in this team. They have gone backwards since the World Cup. And especially gone backwards during his second stint here. And recently, I should add too. Right, you got the Jamaica game, the Trinidad and Tobago game. It just hasn't been very good. This was a chance to turn it all around. They get whacked by Colombia. They have a good showing against Brazil. They're fine against Bolivia. Lose to Panama. Lose to Uruguay. It's not good enough to just keep throwing the same team out there and having the same thing happen. Because there's a very clear narrative as to where this team is. Generally speaking, they get the job done against lower opposition. Sometimes they play pretty well against high-level opposition, but they don't win. And nobody at the highest level is particularly scared of them. Which is where the U.S. has been for the better part of, 25 years now? Because to me, that is, if you boil all of this down, that is the crux of it. This team does not look, feel, act in terms of the results they're getting on the field like they're any different from any other U.S. men's national team. Other teams who've gotten out of the group stage, teams who've gone farther in the World Cup, teams have done better at Copa America. They haven't done anything to separate themselves from the generations and the teams that have come before them. And when your entire starting lineup is playing in Europe, that's a problem. And Copa America was the opportunity to change that, and they didn't. They failed. So that's the first part. That, to me, is the single biggest thing you can lay at Gregg Berhalter and say, we got to do something different. The second one, and Alexi Wallace made this point, and it's a good one. People around this country who don't follow soccer or don't follow soccer closely are going to get invested in this 2026 World Cup when it's on home soil, and because generally when it's World Cups, men's or women's, all of a sudden patriotic fever comes and everybody starts caring about these teams for the first time in 4 years. It would be really helpful to have a coach who can actually unify people. Gregg Berhalter cannot do that at this point. It has nothing to do with him personally. It has to do with the situation that we are in. Because there will be a contingent, maybe even a vast majority of the fan base, that does not want him managing this team anymore. And will not want him managing this team if he continues. And it's some of the frustration, I believe, is invalid, but some of it is valid. It's not like this is coming out of nowhere. They haven't been good enough. And he's got to take some of the responsibility for that. So you cannot have a unified fan base with Gregg Berhalter as your coach. To me, that is the other big part of this. That you get one opportunity on home soil to really get everybody on board with this. That cannot happen if Gregg Berhalter continues as coach. It is for those two reasons that I am 100% on board with the coaching change, and to me, that is the best path forward. This has to look different at the World Cup. Something has to change for this team to get where they believe they should be, and where I and many others believe they can be. Changing the coach is the easy button, but that's where it has to start. Because you cannot just continue to do the same thing, because we're to the point where the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Something has to change. And Gregg Berhalter has been part of the disappointment, the failure, the not getting the job done. So it's not like they're doing this despite Gregg Berhalter's brilliance as coach. There are plenty of reasons to make this coaching change. To me, that U.S. soccer has no choice at this point. In order to maximize success at the 2026 World Cup, somebody else needs to be in charge. The second point. If this team is ever going to figure it out, it has to be now. This was your last chance before the World Cup. We've had Weston McKennie get kicked out of a camp, the Gio Reyna situation, and I'm talking more about him pouting at the World Cup than what his parents did, because he obviously doesn't have control over his parents. Serginho Dest blow up. And now Tim Weah's red card that may have been the single biggest reason this team didn't advance in Copa America. Yes, this team is very young. Those are also a bunch of guys who I listed who have played in the Champions League, who have played in top 5 leagues in Europe, who have been around for a while. They're not 18-year-old kids. They're getting into their, 23, 24, 25. They're established professionals. And there is just a lack of emotional maturity that has always been an issue for me with this team. And we're getting to a point where half of the core players on this team have had some kind of really big emotional collapse. And then you pair that with things like not showing up for the Colombia game the way they need to. And the Tim Weah red card. And, you can keep going down the list. But they clearly just don't have the answers right now in terms of how to take it to the next level. And Carly Lloyd made this point in the Fox post-game show. And I don't agree with Carly Lloyd on all that much sometimes, but I do think she's right on this. Those players are too comfortable. Which is the other big reason for me why the coaching change needs to happen. It's not necessarily Berhalter's fault, but I do think the balance has shifted too far to the comfort side of this. And I'm a big believer that chemistry matters, that culture matters, that Berhalter's done a lot of really good things to help rebuild this program from where it was when he took it over. He's also had an entire World Cup cycle. There is something to the idea of a fresh voice every 4 years is just a good thing. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but there is at least some validity to it. But basically what you had was this group of players decide, we want Berhalter still. And U.S. Soccer and Matt Crocker said, okay. And then we got the same results, if not worse ones. They crashed out of Copa America. Tim Weah gets the red card. They basically said, we've got this, and then showed that they don't. Which goes back to my earlier point that if the World Cup is going to go better, something has to change. They have to find a way to be more emotionally intelligent, more mature, and to just step it up a level in their intensity, their focus, their understanding of the details, the little things that make the difference between wins and losses on the biggest stage against the best opposition. And some of that, I think, needs to be a little bit of uncomfortableness. Uncomfortability, whatever the word is. They've got to be challenged. And I just don't feel like they're being challenged enough right now. And that they are not capable of challenging themselves and kind of doing this internally. Now, I'm also not advocating for Jose Mourinho to come in and coach this team, because I do not believe that that is successful, especially in today's day and age with today's players. That is way too much chaos and way too much constant conflict for me. But there's a middle ground between Gregg Berhalter and Jose Mourinho, which is where this gets interesting in terms of if the U.S. makes a coaching change, who is it? I'm not going to sit here and give time to Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola until that actually becomes a realistic possibility. I don't think Klopp wants to manage. I don't think he wants to manage in the U.S. I can't see Guardiola looking at this team and saying, that's what I want to do next. Maybe I'm wrong. But outside of those two guys, who are you going to get? Especially if potentially you've got England making a coaching change too. because I think Graham Potter is a really interesting possibility. Again, will he take this job? Probably not. But he makes a lot of sense for England too if Gareth Southgate ends up stepping down / being fired at the end of the Euros. So the name I'm going to throw out there that is my realistic prediction without putting too much thought into it is Philadelphia Union's Jim Curtin. They're in the midst of a disastrous season. This thing is falling apart. Nobody thinks it's his fault. I concur. He's done a remarkable job working with what he has. He has also said he would resign to go be an assistant with the U.S. men's national team. So he would certainly resign to go be the manager of the U.S. men's national team. It just feels like the right time for him. I do think he's somebody who could unify and bring that positive energy into 2026. I have some other concerns, but if I just had to guess right now, that's my very kind of instant, without thinking too much, prediction of who's going to be this team's head coach in 2026. If that actually comes to fruition, I'll have more thoughts. We're not getting here because Gregg Berhalter is still the coach as I'm recording this. The last point I want to make in terms of kind of the looking forward and what can change. Watching this tournament, I have come to the conclusion that we are not making nearly enough focus and emphasis on the lack of a number 10 in this team. We use the phrase, creative midfielders, creative players. Yes, generally speaking, the U.S. needs more of those too. But I am talking specifically about a number 10. Gio Reyna is the only one on the roster, and he is not playing as a number 10. In part because of the way Berhalter is deploying him, and in part because you don't have a number 10 in a 4-3-3 system. So, whether you're Gio Reyna's biggest fan or don't really rate him is kind of irrelevant to the conversation because he's not even playing as a 10 to know if that's the solution. Because when this team looks their best, it's because he's on the ball making things happen. I do think there's telling, and I think there's something to that. I know maybe Luciano Acosta comes in and saves the day. I know there was some conversation back about him working on being eligible for the U.S. men's national team. Maybe Reyna is the answer. But if Berhalter continues, one of the things that can change is that you can go away from this 4-3-3. Turn it into a 4-2-3-1. Keep Reyna up the field. Get him on the ball. Because that's not really what Pulisic does. That's not what Weah does. If Balogun's your number 9, that's not what he does. And this team's single biggest issue continues to be failure to create chances. Which is why I said I'm not sure that they're a terrible finishing team, and Balogun was really good finishing in this tournament. The bigger issue is that they're not creating the chances to begin with. And there's only so much you can change in 2 years. Maybe somebody comes through. Maybe you get a significant addition to the roster pool. But the one thing you can do is you can deploy Gio Reyna differently and say, that's our number 10. And actually play him like it. Does that mean they're going to go win the World Cup? No, probably not. But maybe it unlocks some things and lets them be more dynamic moving forward. If there is a coaching change, that is one of the things I'm really curious about is what kind of system is it and where is Reyna used? Because to me, you've got to put him up there with Pulisic, not as part of a kind of balanced 3-person midfield. Let him go be the creative force because there is not another player like him eligible to play for the U.S. right now. That was a lot. Gonna end it there. Of course, there will be more time, more conversation, see what happens with Berhalter's future. So I want to keep this relatively short. I mean, we're 25 minutes in now, but U.S. out of Copa America. Plenty of questions as we head into preparations for the World Cup. Now that basically the opportunity to play high-level opposition is gone. Questions about Gregg Berhalter, questions about this team. It'll be an interesting few months, an interesting couple years for the U.S. men's national team. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.